Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. In this show, we discuss topical foreign policy issues. I have conversations with foreign policy thought leaders and luminaries who discuss their life and career, often with digressions about historic foreign policy events in which their life and career intersected. And we cover often overlooked issues in global affairs. If you want to learn more, visit globaldispatchespodcast.com. And now on with the show. So I've done a few episodes now on the conflict in Yemen, its causes and consequences. But for today's episode, I wanted to explore a different way to understand the crisis in Yemen, and that is through shipping containers. Yemen has two main ports, Hodeidah to the north on the Red Sea and Aden to the south on the Gulf of Aden. Of those two ports, Hodeidah is by far the bigger one, but it is under control of forces aligned with the Houthi rebels, whereas Aden is controlled by forces aligned with the internationally recognized government of Yemen. And that government is supported by a Saudi-led coalition, and that coalition has control over the airspace and sea lanes coming in and out of Yemen. Needless to say, this complicates goods getting in and out of Yemen, and the politics and logistics of sending shipments to Yemen by sea, I think, offers key insights into the dynamics of this conflict and why Yemen is experiencing such a profound humanitarian crisis. Indeed, it is one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world today. My guest, Scott Paul, is the humanitarian policy lead at Oxfam America. He recently returned from a fact-finding trip to the port of Aden and some of its surrounding towns. He wrote about that experience in a piece on the website Just Security, and I'll post a link to that on the website. And after reading his piece, I knew that I had to get Scott back on the show. We kick off discussing some background to the conflict briefly before diving into a longer and very interesting conversation about shipping containers. And after listening to this episode, I think you will likely agree with me that the experience of shipping containers offers some explanatory power for understanding the conflict in Yemen as a whole. A couple of quick notes before we begin. I still have about 7 Global Dispatches podcast stickers. If you'd like a sticker, please leave a review on iTunes, then send me an email, and I'd be happy to send you one of those stickers. And if you want one, please do so quickly before they run out. And as always, if you have suggestions of topics I should cover or people I should interview, send me an email, and you can do so using the contact button on globaldispatchespodcast.com. I always love hearing from you guys, so don't hold back. Feel free to email me anything that's on your mind. All right, now here is my conversation with Scott Paul of Oxfam America.
The coalition controls all of Yemen's airspace with the consent of the government of Yemen. And so it's not just the UN flights, but they approve the manifest on all flights in and out of the country. And you might remember, I was in Yemen in Sana'a when commercial flights to Sana'a were suspended. But even at the time that was happening, the Yemeni flights that were coming in and out would have to stop in Saudi Arabia so that the plane could be inspected and so all the passengers could be approved. So there's no one that gets into Yemen these days that isn't approved by the coalition.
And we should say, by the coalition, you're referring to the Saudi-led coalition that has been prosecuting this war in Yemen against Houthi rebels since 2015. Before we go any further, can you just briefly describe the origins of the war? I know you and I have talked about this on the podcast before, but for those who are kind of coming into the situation with, moderate or low information, can you describe just briefly the roots and the trajectory of this conflict?
Yeah, it's a good idea, although it's a bit dangerous to ask a humanitarian.
We won't get too deep into the weeds here, because there's other aspects of your trip to Yemen that I want to discuss in depth. But before we do, just sort of set the scene, if you might.
And I'm sure, the true Yemen experts around me will probably chastise me for not talking about the decades and centuries that preceded this flare-up. But in short,
And can I just interrupt you there?
yeah,
I
please.
had like a year and a half ago, a true Yemen expert who discussed like the centuries deep roots of this conflict. But for our purposes, let's kind of do the explainer version of this, if
Yeah,
you know what I'm saying.
that sounds fascinating. I might have
Yeah.
to go listen to that. This version probably starts in 2011, 2012, when the late former president Ali Abdullah Saleh was deposed by a revolution. There was a transition process in which a government was appointed and internationally recognized. And then there was a series of conferences to get grassroots input. The Houthis are a group that are based in the north that didn't like where this was going, had long running grievances against the central government, and essentially took the opportunity to displace the central government first from Sana'a, then from Aden in 2015, in what's widely seen as a coup d'etat. And when the government was finally pushed out of Aden in March 2015, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and a number of other countries announced that they would intervene militarily to restore the internationally recognized government of Yemen, and fight a conflict against not only the Houthis but their former adversary, late former president Ali Abdullah Saleh. And things have changed. The conflict has splintered and fragmented substantially since then. There are scores of parties to the conflict, each looking out for their own interests, fighting local battles for local and national objectives. But the underlying dynamic of the conflict remains, which is there's an internationally recognized government that's not in power, and there is an international Arab coalition that has united to restore that government ruled by force.
And that the government that is the sort of de facto power of most of Yemen is in control of Sana'a, which is the capital, and areas in the northern part of the country mostly. But you were able to access government-controlled territory, or the de jure government, the internationally recognized government-controlled territory in Aden. Can you just sort of describe a little bit about what the city was like to you, sort of through your eyes as a humanitarian?
Yeah, and before I do that, though, Mark, I need to complicate things even further because nothing in Yemen is simple. Aden is considered government-controlled territory, but between 2015, when the Houthis were pushed out, and this year, that it was controlled by some troops that were loyal to current President Hadi, and the government of Yemen, but also, number one, backed by the force of the United Arab Emirates, and then also supported and associated with other forces who have sort of formed alliances of convenience, and pledge allegiance to the government of Yemen, even though they're seen to be somewhat independently operating. So the question of who's in control and where is government-controlled territory is generally really complicated in Yemen. And that was complicated further earlier this year, when the Southern Resistance, which has really formed a lot of the military force over the past few years in Aden and the surrounding areas, essentially announced that it was taking power for itself. And so now there's a Southern Transitional Council that is governing Yemen. They say that they still recognize generally the authority and legitimacy of the internationally recognized government, but the sort of the lowercase g government of Prime Minister bin Dagr, they have issues with, and they are administering security.
So it's basically like a splintering of authority. That's happening. That often accompanies like civil wars in general. The longer civil wars tend to drag on, the more that you have these factions and splinters that tend to occur. I mean, you saw it in neighboring Syria as well. So there's no like clear delineation between who is on what side necessarily.
100%. So to your question,
So tell me about your sort of what Aden and its surrounding areas that you visited looked like to you as a humanitarian worker.
Well, I should start by saying Aden is a beautiful city. It's really beautiful and picturesque. It's right on the beach. It has this incredible natural harbor. Despite the slowdown in economic activity, a real buzz of street life throughout the city. But there's some contrasts embedded in that because the city is still showing the marks of the 2015 conflict when the Houthis came down and invaded and then were repelled. Buildings are destroyed. A lot of buildings are partially destroyed. It doesn't appear that a lot has been rebuilt from that time. And I spoke with someone who said that there's more than 200 businesses that were destroyed or whose business had to stop in 2015 that haven't resumed their operations. And so there's there's a real sense, a palpable sense that even though the Southern Transitional Council is in power, even though it's an area that recognizes the legitimacy of the government of Yemen, that this life hasn't picked up yet to the point where it was before, and whatever this new normal is, we're still there. We haven't gone back to the status quo ante. So at the same time, you see you see fruit in markets, you see people going to restaurants, because there is a class of people who live in the cities, specifically the bigger cities, that can afford to pay these higher prices for food and higher prices for daily household items. So there's a lot of activity, and it's an incredibly beautiful place. But it's a place that even wealthier or middle class, the small group of middle class people I spoke with, would say is struggling under the burden of the war.
And one thing that came through to me in reading your reflections that you wrote in Just Security, and I'll post a link to that, is number one, just like how pervasive the economic effects of the conflict are, even in places like Aden today, where there is not like an active hot shooting war happening. Yet the economic burden of the war throughout the country is felt very sharply by people in Aden. And one reason of this, and something I've really found interesting about your reflections, is how the shipping container industry and shipping containers in general can help explain the Yemen civil war. So just to take a step back, can you explain sort of the port of Aden, its relationship to shipping containers, and also how that relationship intersects with that of the port of Hodeidah, which is a much larger port in the country as well, but one that is currently not under control of an area that the internationally recognized government holds?
Yeah, Margaret. The number of things I've become a poor expert at in the humanitarian field is as long as my arm. Shipping and port operations is now one of them. Before I talk about the port, though, you said something that's really important that I want to stress for listeners of this podcast. And before we went live, we were talking a bit about what this could be titled, and we were talking about container shipping. But you said something that really resonated with me about how people perceive the war in Yemen, or generally how people perceive life in conflict. And I feel like another really good title, not just for this podcast, but for any podcast about Yemen, is that war is killing people quietly. And when people see headlines about the war in Yemen, usually it's triggered by a major event, some spectacular attack that results in tens of civilian casualties. People died, people who were wounded, and that's happening in Yemen 100%, and it's incredibly tragic for the people who are affected. But at the same time, every time I see one of those headlines or one of those stories, I get a little bit disappointed that that's the predominant image for people in the United States and around the world about what life is like in Yemen. Most people aren't worried about dodging bombs. Certainly people in Sana'a are concerned about the daily effects of airstrikes. But even in Sana'a, and certainly all around the country, what war looks like to people isn't just landmines and exploding shells. It's ever higher prices. It's impossible choices. It's security concerns that people don't think about, like for women, the escalation of domestic violence or the challenge of going out to fetch supplies in insecure areas or in undergoverned areas. So I'm always really keen to emphasize that and draw that point out. Should we talk about the port, or do you want to
Yeah.
stay there for a minute?
Well, let's talk about the part because it's all connected, right? I
Yeah,
mean, the ability of people to eat is directly tied to the ability of food imports to pass through the major ports of Yemen.
exactly.
One of those ports, and I should stop there. It's something I've seen the statistics cited before, but something like 80% of all of Yemen's food is imported, and
Yeah.
like 70% of all those imports come through the port of Hodeida.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, so for starters, right, Yemen is hugely dependent on imports. I think it's about 90% of its food and now 90% of its fuel is coming from overseas. And so any changes to the process through which those commodities come in is going to have incredible reverberations at a household level. And for the past 3 years or so, Yemen has been subject to what we've called a de facto blockade. I'm glad we've called it only a de facto blockade because for a period of 2 months in November and most of December, the Saudi-led coalition imposed a full blockade where it said nothing is coming in any of these ports, and then only nothing is coming in some of these ports. But in the rest of that period, essentially, it's been like death by strangulation. Um, the coalition has set up regime first to make vessels wait, then to clear them, then to inspect them depending on the commodity and where they're going. And all of these delays and all of these uncertainties about the outcome have massively increased the price of goods. Just because sitting offshore, not knowing whether you're going to be able to bring your ship into port is incredibly costly for the importers. And that cost gets passed along.
so can you maybe just like walk me through what the path is or what the story is of a shipping container that's leaving, say, I don't know, like Dubai maybe is not the best example,
Yeah.
but some major port in the area that has some goods destined for Yemen.
Yeah.
What is that process?
So it depends. It depends on the commodity, and I think Hadeda right now is importing food and fuel, which are critical commodities. And if that goes away, all of the whole of Yemen is in trouble. But so just to get into the process, I spent some time in the Aden Free Zone, which is the container port in the city, and for about 5.5 months, the Saudi-led coalition has closed completely to any cargoes the container port of Hodeidah. So if you're bringing something in to the port of Hodeidah in a container, and in case people don't appreciate what a container is, basically it's a standard giant box that is of a standard size that gets stacked onto big shipping vessels and then taken out of the port and slopped on a truck and then distributed. And there's a global system for tracking these containers. And once you empty one, then you put something else in, and people are keeping track of where containers are all over the world. It's amazing. But with containerized shipping shut down in Hodeidah, that means Aden is the only port for container shipping. So if you've got anything that isn't fuel or isn't liquid, and if you've got anything that isn't bulk or break bulk cargo, so what that means is stuff that just comes out en masse, which you then process or bag on the quay at the port, it's going into a container. So it's most consumer goods.
Mhm.
So with all that background, you want to ship a container from Singapore to Aden because it's the only container port in Yemen. You put the container on your ship, you arrange all the permits, you get credit and finance for it. you ship to Aden, and then you have to wait. First thing that happens is, well, the first few things that happens are one, you have to get permission from a UN process that's been set up. It's called the UN Verification and Inspection Mechanism. The brief backstory about UNVIM, as it's called, is it was set up because the coalition and the government of Yemen wanted confidence that the ships coming into Yemen weren't bringing weapons for the Houthis. And it was set up specifically for those Red Sea ports. Okay, so that's done. Usually takes about 24 hours, sometimes up to 72 hours. So that's done. You also need deconfliction. So basically, it means basically that someone in Riyadh is saying this is not conflict related.
We're not like, don't bomb this ship.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It has like plastics or something, or some sort of consumer good. It has plastic bags or something like that.
Yeah. So that's two. Then you sit in a waiting area for a while. It's called a holding area for some indeterminate period of time, the objective of which is not totally clear to me. Then at some point you apply to the Government of Yemen Ministry of Transportation to have your containers cleared to be imported. And that also takes an indeterminate amount of time, sometimes days, sometimes longer. Because what happens is the request is immediately forwarded to the government of Saudi Arabia. And after that indeterminate period of time, there's essentially two answers. One is approved and two is rejected. But what's important to bear in mind is that even if you have 100 containers on your ship and one of those containers has a prohibited item, then everything is rejected. So what are the prohibited items now? Well, they're not published. There is a sort of a working list that people in the port of Aden have. It consists of things like batteries, solar panels, used cars. Another one is spare parts for mechanics. It's not totally clear, and it varies by the day. Sometimes those things come in, sometimes other things get kept out. And the uncertainty itself is really costly.
And presumably those things are banned because the Saudis think that they have like dual use. They could also be used for like, military purposes, or that's not even clear.
Potentially. I don't want to speculate too much on the on the motives.
Yeah.
But that's a possibility. So anyway, so you get this response back, and the response is container 23 has some batteries in it, so your application is rejected. Well, now you have to go and reapply for the other 99 containers once you've gotten that container off your ship, right? So then you're in that holding and waiting pattern again. So let's say you finally get approved for those 99 containers. Your next step is to ship all of your cargo to Jeddah, where there's an in-person inspection in Jeddah.
So that's which is in Saudi Arabia, we should say, which is Saudi Arabia, in Yemen.
Yeah, right.
You're still not there yet.
But then, let's say that's done. You're still not done, because then when you're finally given clearance to ship your containers to Aden, there's a team of 50 Yemenis supervised by 12 Saudis and Emiratis that are going to go through those containers all over again. And that's going to take time. So all of this time hugely adds up, right? And every day that those goods aren't being delivered to a retailer or a corner store or convenience store, bodega, whoever's selling these goods, it's more rials for the household that isn't earning any.
Mm-hmm. Basically, all of these delays have the effect of increasing the prices of all these goods, and people in Yemen aren't getting paid to start with. So this is just compounding a sort of household financial crisis that is replicated throughout the country.
Exactly. And you've got inflation, and you've got the uncertainty of what exactly is allowed to be brought in. So some shippers are just deciding, nuts to this, I'm shipping to Jazan in Saudi Arabia. It's another port. It's got another market. It costs $2,000 to ship a container from Singapore to Aden. I can ship that container to Jazan for $700 or $800. Sounds like a better deal for me. So the revenue at the port of Aden, which again I want to stress is a government of Yemen controlled port or I should say, a Southern Transitional Council controlled port, jointly with the coalition, and they are losing a huge amount of money, and goods coming through there are becoming much more expensive because of coalition interference and restrictions.
Well, can I ask, like, what's the logic in sort of punishing the government controlled areas as with these sort of onerous restrictions, as opposed to just like punishing the Houthi controlled areas, like the port of Hodeida, which they already do. But why would the Saudis impose all these restrictions over imports to areas that are ostensibly under the control of forces they back?
Yeah, you got me. I wouldn't even presume that the purpose is punishment. I have a really hard time reconstructing what the rationale might be. The one thing I will say is that these are ships that no one is alleging are responsible for the importation of weapons. I mean, if these items are feared because they're dual use, fine. Publish the list, ask the United Nations process to inspect for it, fine. But I mean, there's no allegation that this is the Saudis are making a really, really big deal about the possibility of importation of ballistic missile components to the Houthis, in particular from Iran. But no one, including the Saudis, are alleging that they're coming in on these big commercial shipping vessels. So no idea.
You said earlier, and correct me if I'm wrong, that containers are not permitted in the port of Hodeida. Is that right?
Yeah. That's right.
And that's a much larger port, we should point out.
Yeah. They were before half a year ago. It's a new policy.
And sort of what is coming in and out of Hodeida then?
So Hodeida, as far as I know, still is receiving bulk and break bulk cargo, like big humanitarian shipments. And it's possible that I need to check on this. I'm not sure if humanitarian vessels are bringing in containers, but commercial containers are definitely out.
Not. Okay.
But you can import grain there, and you can import fuel there, and you can import other food. And the grain, fuel is probably the single most important commodity in Yemen, because expensive fuel makes everything else more expensive because of transport costs and refrigeration and electricity. But food is also critical because Aden doesn't have and will never have the capacity to import more grain. And I went over this pretty thoroughly. There are 7 gigantic silos and mills at the port of Hodeida, and an entire distribution network that's sort of formed around that infrastructure. And in Aden, there's 3 small privately held silos with mills attached, and there's just nowhere on the Cape to build more, and it would take forever. So it's just not there's no other way to bring more grain than is coming through Aden right now.
Mm-hmm. And so Hodeida is the most important port for food supplies throughout the country.
Yeah, for food, for fuel, and if it were taking containers, also through containers.
So I guess just kind of stepping back, what does shipping containers tell you about the conflict in Yemen?
One, it's really, really hard to discern the motives of the parties because, like you said, you try to figure out why the coalition's processes is making life harder on officials in the South and on people living in the South. Secondly, that everything is more expensive because of the complications regarding imports. Third, one thing we haven't talked about is, and this I think maybe undercuts one of the assumptions we've been sort of talking around before, just because something is imported through Aden doesn't mean that it's going to benefit the people of Aden or the people in the south of Yemen. One of the really interesting things that I heard in a couple of different meetings with the business community and with people at the port is that about 80% of all of the cargoes that come into Aden end up going north. And so it's not as if there's a Houthi port and a government port. there may be people administering those ports associated with the different parties, but once things come into Yemen, it's in the Yemen market, and the Yemen market has its own rules governed by the country's political economy. And shutting off the spigot at one port isn't going to, in my opinion, fundamentally upset that balance.
Well, Scott, this is very helpful, and I think it's just like a really useful framework in which to kind of understand the entire Yemen civil war. So thank you for your time.
Yeah.
This was explanatory.
It's my pleasure. I love talking about this stuff. It's horrific and tragic, but I really do think that the more people understand how interlinked Yemen's economy is with the import mechanisms at the different ports and how they're interlinked with each other, we're more likely to see an import regime that's going to benefit all of the people in Yemen. So thanks for having me on to explain this.
All right, thanks. All right, thank you all for listening. Thank you to Scott. That was helpful. Like I said, that was, I think, a unique and interesting and useful way of approaching the conflict in Yemen. Not something, not kind of content I think you'd get anywhere else in the podcast world. So if you appreciate that, then show me your love by leaving a review on iTunes, or better yet, becoming a premium subscriber and supporting the show financially, which is always very helpful. Helps me keep the lights on around these parts. All right, we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.